So let's start off with, stay with sort of the story more. Brian seems to be, ever present in so many ways in popular culture still. We were talking about this, how people are, young people are discovering him even now. But he didn't seem to be made out to be a pop star. Maybe, he was into the blues and so forth. It was like Jeff Beck didn't want to be in the Yardbirds when they went pop. Was he not cut out to be a pop star? Was that your impression? Is that sort of where things went wrong?
No, I don't think so at all. I think he was the consummate rock star.
Well, rock star, but pop star. I was sort of drawing a line between them.
He really wanted to be and was a pop star.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean this whole concept that he was just a blues musician is absurd.
Okay.
He had a great ability, and he could play the blues like very few people could. But that he wanted to go back to it is a complete absurdity. He was a real avant-garde artist and a great musician.
But did he? They talk about in the film, and it's my impression that he didn't love all those sort of pop singles that Mick and Keith were writing. That he had his sights set on more artistic ventures.
Well, that's what they try in all these books to present, and it's a total misconception. The thing he couldn't do is he couldn't write those songs because he was a perfectionist. And what he wanted to do, if things fell, he was extremely self-critical, and he didn't want to present material that he thought was inferior. But what he was able to do to those songs that Mick and Keith came up with, Mick and Keith developed this amazing knack of coming up with these great songs, which Brian then would totally take over, enhance in a masterful way. And whatever instrument he picked up, he did it in such a way that a virtuoso sitar player couldn't have played better on Painted Black than Brian Jones did, because he used the sitar in such a way, he just figured out a way to make it incredibly effective. It wouldn't have been the same way if Ravi Shankar had attempted it, he wouldn't have done it and so on. And with every instrument, it was the same way. He had this incredible knack, and he had this ability of picking up anything. He didn't stick with anything, though.
Well, what about, because this is interesting, it gives us a sort of a fuller picture of him as a person. What are you, when you were sitting here watching, you hadn't seen the final cut of the film.
Yeah.
What are we missing, even from a film that kind of just talks about the highlights of his life, of him as a human being? What was he like as a person?
Well, it's very complicated to encapsulate what a person was like, because he was he was a very intelligent person. He was he had this very great curiosity and great ability to delve into esoteric subjects, to hold conversations on philosophy. He was very interested in a lot of things, and he was a great libertine, and so he loved the good life. We all did. We loved flamboyant clothes and all that kind of thing. There's nothing in it about it of how much the peacock imperative and how to draw the chicks forward and all that kind of thing, that was the main thing. And they make him sound always like such a sort of depressed individual who was a tragic figure. He was wonderful fun. We never had a crossword with one another. We chased the same girls. Anita was my girlfriend beforehand. It was, he was an amazing person. He was tremendous fun to be with.
Did you? I mean, you were in that social circle with the Stones and the Beatles and all that. I mean, talk a little bit about swinging London and what it was like in those days.
Well, first of all, we met. I used to play with Vince Taylor, and Vince Taylor had been a star when the Stones were just merely starting. And so when it came that we had to do these shows with this against the Stones, not opening for the Stones, but we were playing against them, and we were determined to defeat them with their own fans, which we managed to do in Paris during these shows, amazingly. And it was so, it was a rivalry. But there were maybe 10 or 15 acts on the bill, people who would play only one song. There was even a magician who came out and had a dove and all this kind of thing and did tricks like that. Then we came out and did our full set, and then there was an intermission. The Stones would come on. At the first time I met Brian, in fact, we were just coming off. There were all these teenage English chicks who were absolutely in hysterics. And Mick was very sort of tautly saying, "You been on?" And Vince Taylor said, "No, we've been rehearsing." And we walked right past him, and Brian Jones came up to me, and we looked at each other and we shook hands, and that was it. We were friends for life. And I said, "Okay, you're coming with me," and I had Anita with me, and Françoise Hardy and some other girls, and we all went, we hit all the clubs, and we're up, that first night we went to Donald Campbell, who would then go on to direct a performance, and we were up all night, basically, with Zuzu, who in this film comes off like this weird, freaked out old woman who was saying a lot of stupid things because she was a lot more fun than in those days than she comes out on this film. And she's blaming all kinds of people and saying all sorts of things that are absolutely not true, which is unfortunate. She was a wonderful girl initially, and we adored her. Anyway, the fun thing on that first night is, can you imagine that we went to this, well, not a great hotel that the Stones were staying in on Boulevard des Capucines, I still remember, and we staggered out of this cab, Brian, Anita, myself, and Zuzu. We staggered out. There were girls, English girls, sleeping on newspapers in front of the hotel, and they popped awake, and a barrage of instamatic photographs was unleashed at us. Unfortunately, I'm still waiting to this day to see what we must have looked like, It was incredible.
So talk about the relationship. How did it grow from there? Because that sounds like a fun and wild night.
Yeah, it started then, and because Anita hooked up with him later on that year, which is 5, we both were on a slightly different arc, and I ended up in America as well in '65 and on a totally different course. And then at some point, the following year, '66, Anita was living with Brian, and so we saw each other constantly, henceforth. And then at some point at the end of '66, I was summoned by my father to Rome, where I met Romina Power, etc. And the Stones came through, and I went to see them. They, in turn, came and hung out with me all night long at Villa Medici, and there's been incredible adventures there. And then Brian said, "Oh, you're going to America to do this film. Why don't you, if you're going to London now, why don't you stay at my house? I'll give you my car, driver, and everything. When we finish the tour, you come and pick me up, and we'll hang together." And that's how I ended up at Courtfield Road, spending a lot of time there, and that's how I met Jimi Hendrix, thanks to Brian, and so on and so forth. So we had incredibly good times, which, according to these hacks, is always, "Oh, he was so depressed because Anita had left." No, Anita had left. He was having a fantastic time at the same time. There were lots of girls.
But the drug bust does seem to be a pivotal point in his life. Whether it's the film or the books or just what I know about him.
The drug bust was a disaster, but at first you can't imagine how much we laughed at it because it was farcical. The whole thing was so ludicrous that at first we thought, "Hey, this is a joke." We found that the police had told the press. And so there must have been, as I say in the film, there must have been 30 people calling at that time saying, "Have you been busted?" And we said, What are you talking about? Because the papers were full, the front pages were full of Mick and Keith at Chichester on trial. So we said, "This is ridiculous, it can't be happening." And so we thought it was journalists going crazy and trying to get a reaction. We never believed that the police would actually come. And so when they did come, we kept thinking it's reporters, and of course it was the police. And they had planted the drugs that were involved because Brian had insisted that I go with him. Instead of going to America to do the film, he said, "No, I'm not going to Cannes unless you come along with me." So I had gone. We'd been in Cannes. We'd been in Paris, and we had gone back. And that was the day after we came back. The drugs that were found in that flat were the drugs that the police planted. The rest was absolutely useless to anybody. The cocaine was non-existent. It was, as I say in the film, 1,000th of a grain. Basically, you had to look up and you saw a vague crystal like that. And there was methadone we were both charged with, but the most desperate junkie couldn't have used it. It was all moldy and in an old suitcase that Anita had left behind and so on. And, but they charged us with it all the same. And so, they used that stupid language. Man, and things like that. They tried to make it plausible, and the script was very bad. So at first, we thought it was fun, and we laughed, and you see us laughing in the car and all that sort of thing. But then the second time we appeared in court, we saw the police lie. That's the time when you see me saying, "God, we looked at each other and we said, is it possible that Scotland Yard, are lying? And then we started to get a bit worried. Then there was this thing that where Brian got into Mandrax, and then it was a disaster.
And also he was it sounds like getting bad legal advice. They wanted him to stay away from you. He became isolated. He was drinking a lot more, right?
Well, he took Mandrax. Mandrax was the real disaster. He started to Mandrax is not a drug you want to drink with and bend it, as it were, because it was the worst thing I've ever witnessed, and it was heartbreaking. It was absolutely heartbreaking.
So talk a little bit about the change in his personality after that, because he did withdraw quite a bit, didn't he?
Well, you see, during that time, there were months between the time we were busted and the time that we finally came up on trial. I was trying to find a way with powerful friends to get my passport back because I was stuck in England at that time. And it was thanks to the Beatles that I survived, in fact. But, you know, because I couldn't get any money, I couldn't do anything. I couldn't report for work in Hollywood. I mean, it was a bloody disaster. And so, you know, meanwhile, Brian went steadily from bad to worse during those months. And sadly, he took the bad advice from his legal team. I came on that 30th of October 1967. I arrived at court and they said they're dropping all charges against you, you're going to be cleared. So I said, oh really, then we've won the case. So I ran up to Brian and I said, listen, what are you doing? He said, I'm pleading guilty. I said, are you crazy? We won the bloody thing, you know, and he wouldn't, I practically got down on my knees and said, you can't do that. And he didn't realize that by pleading guilty, he would really put the last nails in his coffin because he'd never work in America again at that time until the Lennon precedent and all that. A drug conviction would totally bar you from anything else. And that was a problem. Also, they were giving me an award. If Brian had pleaded not guilty and we'd won the case like Mick and Keith eventually did, both Brian and I would have gotten an enormous amount of money from the government for false arrest, sure. which it was, and the whole persecution and loss of income and the rest of it.
There are a lot of, I want to leave time for people's questions, but I have one last question. There are a lot of competing viewpoints about the circumstances of his death. You certainly have your own opinion on what happened. Talk a little bit about, you know, what you saw on the screen, because there's a lot of different viewpoints, and what you feel sort of happened in the last days.
Well, that's the most depressing thing of all. I hate to talk about and concentrate. They concentrate too much, you know, to talk
There's
about.
a lot of screen time about that.
There's too much screen time on these sordid events, because that's what they were, sordid events. They're just dreadful. And it was all a matter of these rip-off workers not doing the job and accumulating these bills, escalating bills. They had stolen a lot from Brian, they'd stolen on the materials and the rest of it. And my great regret is that I didn't go there. I could have gone there. And had I gone there, I guarantee you that none of these people would have gotten away with it, because I wouldn't have allowed any such thing to have taken place. But I didn't go, I was involved in other stuff, and it's an eternal regret. Because Alan Klein was never sending money that was owed to the Rolling Stones. There was forever at Maddox Street, the Rolling Stones office, there was ever a cry, oh, Bill Wyman's phone bill hasn't been paid, and so on. You know, it was ridiculous. It was very petty, and money was like pulling teeth to get the Stones' own money to finally be remitted. So when there was this, when sadly they had to decide that they couldn't go on with Brian, that Brian no longer could function, that he'd become totally erratic and so on. And it was decided that he would be replaced with Mick Taylor. Then, you know, there should have been the money to, he was totally broke by then, in fact, because he'd overspent and he constantly ordered more stuff and so on. And he owed all this money which was in fact completely inflated, as they correctly showed in the film.
Let's take some questions from the audience. Anybody out there have a question for Prince Dash? Come on, don't be shy. Yes, shout it out.
Were you able to see any of the recording sessions for any of the Satanic Majesty's record?
Sorry?
Did you see any of the recording sessions for Satanic Majesties?
Oh yeah,
Talk about it.
absolutely.
He wants to hear about it.
They came and they constantly came and played me all those songs and said, but the Satanic Majesty's sessions were extremely, took place. This was the height of psychedelia, so everybody was always coming in at odd hours and doing a little bit and then drifting off and so on and so forth. It wasn't like in a movie where everybody's there and so on. I heard a lot of the songs because Mick and Keith brought them when I was in Italy at the time. Anita was doing Barbarella, and they came and said, well, what do you think of this? And played me, and what kind of music does this remind you of? And there were tracks without vocals that sounded like Turkish music, it was very odd. And then Mick and Keith wrote Citadel at the Villa Medici, which was the palace that I lived in at the time in Rome.
Interesting. Anybody else? Yeah, go for it.
Did Brian Jones ever get any production credits on any of the songs where he did the musical area?
Did Brian get any production credits?
Where he did the instrumentals on a lot of the classic songs that are referenced in the film. Like, does his family reap anything from it?
Does he make any money for production from the Stones records?
I don't think so. I don't think anybody was concerned in those days with that type of thing. The whole credits thing. We used to think, we had totally bizarre views about what publishing could mean. We used to think it was only sheet music, which we thought was ridiculous. When people could get you to sign over your publishing because we thought, oh, it's just sheet music, You didn't realize that it was, you would be getting tons of money in the future out of publishing things. But nobody realized in the credits aspect, it had been decided there was a structure called Rolling Stones Limited. The Rolling Stones Limited, and the Rolling Stones Limited was a partnership of which every member took X amount of money per annum. And that's how it worked. And they collected the money and nobody ever really worried about it.
Anybody else? Go for it.
Here.
Oh, we're over here. Go ahead.
You mentioned about the girls sitting on the newspapers, and I know I've heard Bill Wyman and others talking about the insanity of the shows they were playing. Like they couldn't even get through 20 minutes of the set because it would be overrun with kids just grabbing at them. Did you experience any of that?
Absolutely. First of all, the least garage band has today better equipment than anybody had in the mid-60s because there were no stage monitors. So when you were singing and the girls were screaming, you couldn't really hear what the hell the other instruments were playing. It was absolutely crazy, and there was such a volume of screaming. I mean, it was amazing. It made you laugh because you were totally lost, and at the same time there was this excitement, and that derived from being on stage and these people screaming at you and all that kind of thing, and they were in total hysterics. And yes, one thing that is, you've said today the Stones will play at least an hour and a half, if not 2 hours or more. In those days, it was 20 minutes tops, you know, and that was the set, and you were done. In any case, you couldn't hear anything, so it was, you know, academic.
You had a question over here. Go ahead.
Stash, you weren't the only people that could be with Brian in the recording studio. Is there a certain instance or moment that really struck out to you with Brian in the studio?
In the studio?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Brian, you should have seen how Brian was recording, was really ruling the roost and doing this whole thing on Ruby Tuesday. And he plays this recorder part, and I'm kind of blown away. And I go up to him and he says, "Oh, I got to do it again." I say, "Why?" "It's a quarter of a tone off," he says. Quarter of a tone off, okay. You know, he's doing it again, and everybody's, you know, when they say, "Oh, Brian was victimized by the rest of the band and they didn't allow him," this is bullshit, because he really was the lord of the studio in those days.
Interesting one. Yeah, go for it.
But there was an argument on that he didn't get a writing credit that he maybe deserved.
He probably did, but then again, you know, how many, do you know about this group of musicians in LA called the Wrecking Crew? They wrote most of the great riffs and the great hits. They didn't get production credits. That's the way it was. That's absolutely the way it was. It was decided from the onset, and nobody paid it any mind. Yes, at some point there was, "Oh, I could be getting more." But Brian never expressed any regrets about this sort of thing, oddly enough.
Anybody else? Yeah, go for it.
Sorry?
Favorite records and favorite instruments Brian liked to play?
Favorite records? Well, there's not just one. I mean, you mean by other artists? Well, you know, oddly enough, Slim Harpo, you know, I'm a King Bee, was one of Brian's favorite records. He had a vast knowledge of all kinds of music, but we also listened, I remember we had the Doors' first album, and we listened a lot to that first album, and there was a song that Brian really loved called 20th Century Fox, and that was one we thought was really great. Brian thought it was really good. But he, you know, he was very eclectic, and he played, he had all sorts of odd instruments, and it would be a question of the mood of the time as to what would be his favorite. He had, at Courtfield Road, at least 50 different instruments, and guitars and all that kind of marvelous stuff.
Anybody else? One last one, sure.
My name is Gregory, and I've been aware of you for quite a long time. You know, your history is entwined. You know, I mean, you were there, you had your own band, but I just want to thank you on behalf of everybody here for being a friend to Brian Jones, because I've read everything, I've seen about you, but you've never seemed to exploit me in any way. I think that's a true sign of a friend. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, I try to keep the flame alive, because so many hacks have written stuff, and I've challenged one of them, who will remain nameless, and I've said, "Where do you get this stuff?" And he said, I said, you know, for instance, they wrote that, oh, Bob Dylan bought the coffin that Brian was buried in, and they repeated it, patent, absolute nonsense, couldn't possibly have happened. If you know Bob at all, you would have known that it was a no in any case. And why should he? You know, no, it wasn't like that. And this is, I asked this guy, why did you write that? And he said, well, you know, I had a deadline, I had to do it and all that. And he wrote what somebody else had written. And this is the way history is being written. I'm 77. By the time I'm no longer present on this plane of existence, God knows what distortions will come about. It's ridiculous. You know, and the irony of it all is when I was 22 and Brian was 23, we swore, we said, we're the never reach 25 group, you know.
All right, well, on that note, I'd like to wrap things up. Thank you, everybody, for sticking around. Big round of applause for Big Stash.